I don't have a copy of the sheet with me up here. I apologize for that. I don't know if this is the next thing that was on the sheet. I think the parts of an argument, the Tolman model, was the next thing on the sheet. But I want to skip that for a little bit longer because there's one other thing that I think is good to talk about, and that is some types of argumentation. I took some notes here. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I believe, Brace, do I have this on the sheet? Do I have deduction, induction? Is that on the question sheets?
Yes.
It is. Okay, so skip to that section if you took notes there or if you had some thoughts there. We're going to talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the model of an argument, because I think, again, these topics are also useful in helping us see when something is logical, when something is reasonable. So, I want to talk about types of arguments. You have deductive arguments, you have inductive arguments. What do those things mean? Again, I'm not really concerned with terminology or focusing on understanding these terms. It helps to be exposed to them, but we'll start with deduction. Anyone want to just kick things off? How would you, in a sentence, describe deductive reasoning? What's kind of the key feature that it has?
If this is true, then this must be true.
Right. It's really dependent on if-then. And the key thing about deductive reasoning is that if the premises are true, and if the logical progression of the statements is also true, then deductive reasoning is certain. That's the core function of deductive reasoning. The classic example would be a syllogism, is the word for what Dan described. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You start from general true statements, general premises that are true, and if you can prove each one being true, then the end conclusion is a necessity. I wanted to think about this for a second because I think it should be noted that for most of our everyday reasoning and argumentation, generally we don't follow these pure rules of deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is actually quite rare, I would say, in the wild, because it's quite hard sometimes to form a premise that is undeniably always true. Deductive reasoning really has its roots in geometry and math, because in that realm there are things that are always unequivocally true, and it's quite easy to form if-then statements that rely on those things being true. But in the real world, it's a lot harder to do that. I made some examples here of deduction, and I wanted us to look through these. So here's an example of a syllogism. These are from the book Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig, these couple of examples. Number one, if God exists, then moral objective values must exist. Number two, objective moral values do exist. Three, therefore, God exists. So remember, the two things that are required for an argument to be sound, a deductive argument to be sound, is that the statements of the premises are true and that the logic is valid. So I want you to think about this statement again, and is this example correct? If God exists, then moral values exist. Objective moral values exist. Therefore, God exists. What do you think? Okay. Dad says, not an example of deductive reasoning. Explain your answer.
If A, then B, therefore A, doesn't make any sense. And that's what the statement says. The atheists argue that there are absolute moral values, but deny the existence of God. And as far as an example of deductive reasoning, I agree with them. There can be absolute moral objectives without the existence of God. Others may disagree with that statement, but I don't think that's an example of deductive reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I use these examples not to get us too deep into the content of the statements per se, although I think we can go there. Mainly it's just to show how something can sound like a reasonably crafted argument. This has the semblance of appearing to be a logical argument, but this is actually a fallacy, is what this is right here. This is a fallacy. Essentially, it's drawing proof from the conclusion. You are stating that the conclusion is known to be true, therefore the premise is true. You can see how the conclusion objective moral values exist depends in the premise 1 on the existence of God. But then in premise 2, we just affirm that the conclusion is true and then use that to prove the premise. So it's backwards, really, from the way that this is supposed to work. Brace, you had a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest that B is an absolute truth, but that because B exists, I would agree that number 1 is also true. But as Greg said, I mean, the reality is it is not an accepted truth just because there are moral values or there are moral principles that most people hold on to, that there is a God.
Mm-hmm.
I would disagree with that because I don't think there can be a morality or an absolute truth without the existence of God. But as he said, there are people who, so it's not an accepted truth that there has to be a God for there to be moral values.
Right.
And that's the issue. Is like you said, you're trying to prove a point by accepting a conclusion as valid when not everybody does. So
Right.
It's not going to be helpful.
Yeah, ignoring for a minute the truth of the individual statements.
Right.
If this was to be a logically sound, structured argument, you would say if God exists, then moral values exist. 2, God exists. 3, therefore we can say moral values exist. That argument is logically sound in its structure. Now the question there would be, some people would question the premise God exists. They would ask for, well, what's your proof to know that that's the case? So that's just to show you a bit of how this can, these deductive reasoning arguments can sometimes trip us up. Here's another one from the same source, another example. If Jesus is not Lord, then he would be a liar or a lunatic. This is actually a quote that I believe C.S. Lewis made. If Jesus is not Lord, then he is a liar or a lunatic. Premise 2, Jesus was neither a liar nor a lunatic. Premise 3, therefore Jesus is Lord. Now, here we have the structure, and I've written it out here. If not A, then B, and then we say B is not the case, B is not true, therefore A is true, or the antecedent of A is true. Again, if Jesus is not Lord, then he would be liar or lunatic. We're saying that's not the case, so the condition that would lead to Jesus being a liar or lunatic, if he wasn't Lord, is therefore not true, so Jesus is Lord. This is logically sound, but what about the premises? Is this still a sound example of deductive reasoning? I already told you the logical structure is correct. It's technically correct here.
Well, it's based a lot on opinion
Okay.
and perception and interpretation. It's not truly based on fact.
So I think the key problem with this statement here is premise number 1. This, if Jesus is not Lord, then he is either a liar or a lunatic. How might that be an untrue premise, Aaron? Is there an alternate choice than simply Jesus is a liar or a lunatic if he's not Lord?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's plenty of
Jesus is not
alternatives.
Lord, he could just be a good guy.
He could just be a good guy, a prophet, a teacher. Another example is he's a legend. He's made up. You know, that's another possibility that people would point to. Well, Jesus isn't a liar or a lunatic, but he's not Lord because people wrote things and embellished, and it's just a story about this person. So there's other premises that people would try to use to argue this point that go against this assumption. This makes assumptions that aren't, people wouldn't accept on face value. Dad?
Another possible explanation is that Jesus was misunderstood. And so the people that concluded he was either a liar or a lunatic just didn't understand what he had to say. And I'd say that fits the reality of those who've made that conclusion better than others. But the fact that Jesus is misunderstood is not proof that he is Lord either. Because he may have been trying to say something that we didn't understand, and we inferred that he was implying he was deity. So if I can be misunderstood, there are other explanations as to why Jesus may or may not be Lord, depending upon the statements that he made.
Right. So, yeah, I agree. There's alternate explanations. There's alternate points that the premises are kind of assuming away and assuming couldn't be brought up. So these are just examples of things that fundamentally we would agree with both of these end claims, right? We would agree with the claim that God exists. We agree with the claim that Jesus is Lord. But it's a point that sometimes we have to be careful. What are we excluding or sweeping under the rug? Or what are we reasoning backwards? You know, we're starting with the point that God exists, and we're using that to reason backwards to explain the premises. Those are both pitfalls that we can drop into. All right, moving on to inductive reasoning. Any questions on deduction? I want to try to get through this a little quickly because my notes are a mess. But inductive reasoning is the idea that observations made about past events and past regularities can lead to conclusions and predictions about future events or general truths. So every day you observe the sun rise in the east and the sun sets in the west. Every day. And you've never seen an example where the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. So you conclude, you make the prediction that the sun always rises in the east, and you decide that that's a truth based on your repeated history of observation. How about another example? You see a robin, it's flying. You see a cardinal, it flies. You see a pigeon fly, you see an eagle fly, and so you make the inductive argument, birds fly. Now what's the issue with that one?
Some birds don't fly.
Not all birds fly. You see a penguin, and now you have a problem. You know, now your conclusion has a contradictory example. And so this is one of the key features of inductive reasoning, is that one counterexample dismantles the argument, and you have to reframe what your argument is. Then maybe you might say, okay, not all birds fly, but every bird I've ever seen has feathers, so all birds have feathers. I actually don't know if there's a bird out there that doesn't have feathers, so you can check on that. I think they all do. I think that's one of the biological markers of the category of bird. Examples of inductive reasoning include studies that show a statistical frequency of something happening. So you have a sample set that receives a drug, group A. Group B receives a placebo that looks like the drug but isn't, and group C gets nothing. And so you look at the results, and hey, group A saw an improvement in their symptoms, group B and C both didn't, and you repeat this experiment, and it can lead to conclusions that generally can be quite reliable. We use this kind of arguing a lot more often than we do deductive reasoning in the real world. This is kind of the way humans reason. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia. A good inductive argument receives some support from the truths of its premises. There can never be a 100% certain conclusion drawn via this method. They also note that the scientific method is an example of this kind of reasoning. So you form a hypothesis and you run experiments to test whether or not that hypothesis bears out to be true each time, and it needs to be repeatable. Is that a problem for us, that a good inductive argument gets some support from the truth of its premises? Every additional observation you make, it makes it a little more trustworthy, but you're never 100% certain. Does that make us uncomfortable?
I think that it's something that we use quite frequently.
That's true. It is something that we use quite frequently. Really, I think in our daily lives and in really the way we think day to day, we shouldn't be too unfamiliar with this practice of, you've seen it before, you've seen it work this way all the time, so you can probably rely on it working that way again. I think that's probably what you meant by saying we better not be too worried about this.
And our faith is based on fulfilled prophecies that we can read. And if every prophecy that God has given has been proven to the point, I mean, not every prophecy, because there's things that happen in the end, but our determination that things are going to happen in the end, just as God says, are because the other prophecies were true.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, humans do a pretty good job of recognizing patterns. Sometimes we create a pattern where we think there's one, but for the most part, we tend to see patterns. You ever drive around and look at cars and see, like, that car has a face, that car is grinning, that car has a frowny face? I don't know if you do this. It's because, and there's been studies of this, that we're coded to recognize patterns like a face. Looking at a face is something that we're all very familiar with doing. And so when we see, oh, that tree has a couple knots and a branch, that tree has a face, and we see it where it isn't there. That's us displaying our innate desire to recognize patterns. You got a hand up?
Yeah, I think the basic use of inductive reasoning is we're comfortable with, but I think we're also comfortable with the phrase, to every rule there is an exception. I think as long as you're willing to accept that you have seen and observed something that challenges your premise, you're open-minded enough to say, well, there could just be that there are rare conclusions that this doesn't help me, but in the general case, we've got to have something to frame our world with.
Yep.
And this is the reason why many rejected Jesus. Is there have been many who have risen up and said they are the Messiah, and they have all failed. So this one's going to fail too.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a case where sound reasoning led to a false conclusion.
Right. And when we're faced with an example that doesn't match the conclusion that we tried to draw with inductive reasoning, someone shows us a counterexample that undoes the claim that we were trying to make, I think what Dad says is important. We have to approach it with a mindset that, yes, if I see something that is counter to this claim I'm trying to prove, I'm going to be willing to say that, okay, that disproves what I was trying to convince you of. That disproves my claim. Now let's look at the entire body of evidence and revise the claim. Let's see are there other claims or conclusions that can now explain all of the observations we've made, plus this new observation that seems to be different. In Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, he actually wrote a sentence where he acknowledged this based on the observations that he'd made at the time. Darwin made a statement, I think near the end of the book, where he said, if it can be shown that there is an organ or a system in a creature that requires, that cannot function if it is being built up in intermediate steps. So if there's, say you have one of the classic examples people point to is an eye. If you have an eye and the eye cannot function until every piece is fully formed, you can't have half an eye work, you can't have a quarter of an eye work. Then Darwin said, if you can point to an example of a creature where it cannot exist until everything is fully formed, then that would be a counterexample to this theory that I'm writing about. And of course, he wrote that at the time. There's been more observations made since then that have kind of revised the conclusion of the theory. Some people really latch on to that as, oh, look, that can't be the case, so here's counterexamples. We'll actually talk about that a bit on the next lesson. It's the concept of irreducible complexity is what it's called. That there are some functions or structures within creatures or within natural systems that you can't have one piece missing. You can't evolve one piece of it, then another piece, then another piece. It won't work until you have all the pieces working together. So we'll examine that a little bit more later. I have some issues with that argument, but we won't get off topic here. These other two, abduction and analogy. So again, don't worry about the words. Abduction just means after you've observed relevant facts and you draw a conclusion that could explain the cause of those things that you observed. And this is also something that we do all the time, every day. This happens in medicine all the time. You look at a person's symptoms, a doctor looks at, okay, they have all these symptoms. What is something that can be the cause of all of these symptoms that I'm observing? What is the disease that can result in all of these things? It happens in a court of law. If you're on a jury, you're being asked to weigh a body of evidence and not make a prediction about what's going to happen in the future. You're being asked to draw a conclusion about what happened in the past that explains all of the evidence that we've seen in this case. There was, there was tire marks in the driveway that matched this car, and there was dirt on the shoe footprints that matched this location. How do you explain those things that we observed? How do you explain that looking backward? And this abduction is a very big part of trying to look at the origins of the universe. How do you explain the existence of matter? How do you explain the existence of life? How do you explain the existence of variation in the species that we see? All of these things rely on a kind of backward-looking seeking of explanation. The note here from the reading I did says that abduction becomes harder to say if it's logically sound because of a human tendency to seek causal explanations for things, often overshooting reality. So we have to be careful sometimes when we're looking for an explanation for something that we can't explain, that we don't go too far. It's very easy for us to pick some fantastic or pick some outlandish cause for something that we can't explain. It's the whole thing with, UFOs. People see a dot in a video and they're like, oh, that's a spaceship, and okay, what are all the things that it could be? Try to think about all the potential causes. And then finally, argument from analogy. This might seem like just a speaking tool or something you throw into a speech or a paper to make it sound interesting, but you can make legitimate arguments based on analogies. If you argue that two things are similar, so what is true of one thing is likely to be true of another thing, you can use an analog, an example, to try to prove a point or at least explain a point further so that it's more easily understood. These are commonly used in a lot of philosophy, and they are used in theology as well. I neglected to write down the name of the philosopher, but there was a theologian who wrote the watchmaker on the beach, the watch on the beach argument for irreducible complexity. He used an analogy of a watch found on a beach and made the claim, any sufficiently complex system or complex device begs the existence of one who designed it to be that way. It appears to be made for a function, so you would say someone designed it for a certain function. And he made the argument from analogy that if we observe the natural world and the natural cosmos and how it operates and it works, and it seems to be, each part seems to be designed for the other, and it works as a system with purpose, then because those traits are similar, you would say that the existence of a designer is similar. Again, I think there's some failures of the watchmaker argument, but it is an example of an argument by analogy. Billy Sunday had the quote, if going to church made you a Christian, then sitting in a garage would make you a car. To use an analogy of, it's not just about going and sitting in church. There's more to being a Christian than just that. So we're not talking about garages and cars, but we're talking about an analogy. One more I found, and I have to share it because I think it's weird and cool, is the Chinese room argument. This is an analogy about AI and whether or not it has consciousness. The idea is, imagine a room and there's someone sitting in the room and you slip a paper under the door that has Chinese writing on it and you don't know Chinese. Well, the person sitting in the room also doesn't know Chinese, but he has a computer and he can just punch it in and it gives him a translation, and he slips the paper back under the door with the English translation. From the outside, it looks like I slip it in and someone who knows Chinese slipped a paper out. But in fact, nobody knows Chinese in this scenario. It's just spitting out results without understanding. The person doing the translating doesn't even understand what they're translating. So that's an analogy to point to, does a machine have the ability to comprehend?
Hey, Andrew?
Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
An analogy that a lot of us guys understand, you put dishes in the sink, they magically appear clean in the cabinets. So the sink has some magical powers to make them go where they want to go.
So something that has a similar trait, you leave your tools out in the garage and they always stay where they were, So there's another analogy that undoes the argument there. All right. Any other comments about these categories of argument? Deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, abduction, again, that's explaining a cause for things that we've seen in the past, and arguing by analogy. Any comments or other points people want to throw in? Brace, can I see the sheet for a second? Oh. Okay. Thank you.
Andrew, real quick, one of the things with abduction is your experience in a matter will either help or hinder your abductive reasoning. If you have zero experience, your conclusion could be way off base, but the more experienced and more learned you are in a topic, the better your reasoning and the more sound it becomes. So if you look at, take water for example. You know, the common, you ask somebody what temperature does water freeze at, they'll tell you 32 degrees. Well, you ask them, well, then what temperature does ice melt? And they'll tell you 33 degrees. Well, actually, ice exists at either 32 degrees, and water can exist at 32 degrees. Because it's based on a whole different set of heat that is in the ice. So ice and water can both exist at 32 degrees. Water at atmospheric pressure cannot exist at 31 degrees. It's all ice. Ice can't exist at 33 degrees. So when you understand that, we can all assume if we see a glass of water, and I ask you, what temperature is that water? You can say, well, it's above 32 degrees. And if I have a block of ice, if I say, what temperature is that ice? You can say it's, logically below 32 degrees. But there's so much that once you learn more about a topic, and you can have a better logical conclusion.
Right. So to summarize, maybe a more complete knowledge of a topic can help us avoid pitfalls of arguing something incorrectly. Arguing from a lack of knowledge about something is dangerous because you will make statements that will reveal your ignorance. You will make statements that someone who knows more about the topic can point out. This happens a lot. I'm going to say this happens a lot when Christians try to argue the point of evolution, and they look at the things that people who have dedicated their entire careers to studying this kind of thing will say. A key example is you'll hear people say, I just don't see how any of this could come about by chance. I don't see how species could become so designed by chance. And if you make that point, an evolutionary biologist is going to say, you're absolutely right. It's not random chance, because that's not what natural selection actually claims to be doing. There's claims and arguments made that natural selection is not chance, it's not a roll of the dice, but instead it's seeing the dominance of something that does a little better than something else. And so, anyway, if we keep it too simplistic and we don't look into what people are saying, we can reveal that we're not hearing the other side. We're not thinking about what the other side is saying. So that's a good point, Aaron.
Don't you think humankind is always looking for the most simple explanation for the most part? Aren't we commonly seeking that which is the easiest to remember and process rather than that which fits the circumstances the best?
In the sense that it stays in the mind and it's easier to recall, maybe. I tend to think humans have a knack for the fantastical. We tend to be pretty good at really convoluted explanations as well. One of those we'll encounter when we get to the next lesson. There's a point made in the, I forget if it's the argument that the universe is very fine-tuned, right? All these things seem to be just right. Why is it just right for life to exist? Why is it just right for stars to form and for stars to exist? And there's an explanation that a naturalist can give, which is, well, there's infinite universes, and so we just happen to be in the universe where everything's just right. It's quite possible to be very far-reaching when sometimes we're searching for an explanation. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to the Tolman model. Any other questions on those modes of reasoning? Or just clarifications, anything people want, hey, can you explain that or say that in different words? I won't be offended by that because I think everything makes sense in my mind, and I know that can't be the case. Okay. So this comes from Purdue Online Writing Lab, actually. I always used to think OWL was some sort of, it had something to do with owls. It's just online writing lab, and it took me forever to learn that. But if you've ever written an essay in high school or college, you've probably been on this website, at least in the age of the internet, if you did so. Sorry, if you wrote essays and you had to, do the index cards in the library and pick it out on a typewriter, I'm sorry, I can't help you. So, the pieces of an argument. The big three are claim, grounds, and warrant, okay? So, the claim. The claim is the assertion that you would like to prove. That is the thing that that's the end goal, is the claim. Sometimes it's called the conclusion, but in other words, it is the main argument. So in the case of an argument where we say, therefore God exists, that is the claim, right? The grounds of an argument are the foundational parts that you're using as evidence. They are the evidence and the facts that you use to help support the claim. And the last one is called the warrant. And warrants are sometimes implied and not stated, and sometimes they are stated explicitly. They are the assumptions and the logical links that take you from the grounds, the evidence, to the claim. So we'll look at an example of this here. Ignore the other categories for a second. Just look at these three. I've got a diagram here showing grounds, claim, and warrant. Okay? So we're trying to claim there are dogs nearby. And how we do that is, well, our grounds, our evidence is, you hear a barking and a howling sound in the distance. And the warrant says dogs are animals that bark and howl. Okay, so we think about this. We've got some evidence. I've observed barking and howling. I know that logically dogs are animals that bark and howl, so my claim is that there must be dogs nearby. That is, at its most simplest form, a structure of grounds, a warrant, and a claim. There's some other things that can be sometimes present and sometimes not in a Tolman model argument. One of those is backing. Backing is additional support of the warrant. So if you need some more evidence to prove that each step in your reasoning is correct, then that would be an example of backing. Maybe giving an example where similar reasoning has proven true in the past, that would be an example of backing. So if I'm arguing that, if we go from a free market energy sector to a state-controlled energy sector, if the oil companies get owned by the government, and then somebody says that's not going to work, that never works, and then they say for backing, well, Venezuela tried that. Venezuela owns their oil extraction industry and they're bankrupt or whatever. That would be an attempt at backing for a warrant, is using a separate example. A qualifier is a statement that you put on the claim. This is something you do as the arguer. It shows that a claim may not be true in all circumstances. If you use words like presumably or so there, some of the times or many of the times, those are words that help the audience understand that there are instances where the claim may not be correct. And many of the things you'll see out there that I've read say qualifiers lend credibility to you as an arguer because you are acknowledging I could be wrong and there could be cases where this is incorrect. And then the last piece is a rebuttal. This is kind of similar. A rebuttal is an acknowledgement of what could be another valid view of the situation. So I could be wrong. Here could be an alternate explanation. So going back to our dog example, seeing now the whole picture, you hear You hear barking and howling in the distance. There's your grounds. There's your evidence. Your warrant is dogs are animals that bark and howl. Qualifier. So the chances are there are dogs nearby. That's a qualifier on the claim. So you're not stating that I'm absolutely correct that there are dogs nearby. You're saying I am fairly sure that there are dogs nearby. You can see the difference there. Maybe an example of backing for that warrant would be you know that your neighbor Tom has 2 large German Shepherds and they are prone to barking. So there's some additional information that helps the warrant make sense. And finally, an example here they give for rebuttal. There are dogs nearby, rebuttal, unless there's wolves or coyotes nearby. I guess wolves or coyotes don't count as dogs in this instance, but you're conceding that maybe there's something else that's an alternate explanation. So that's kind of the general structure. What I'd like us to do now is to try to do this based on some statements. So I'm not going to go to the passages just yet. I want to do this other one first. Here's the practice argument for the Tolman model. Our toothpaste results in 50% whiter teeth after just 2 weeks of use compared to our top competitor. Buy a pack today. So, who would like to give me the claim? What is the claim made in this argument?
That toothpaste, yeah, 50%, or the first part you said.
So, that it makes your teeth 50% whiter?
In 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, okay. I would say that's not the claim made in this statement. Think of this as an advertisement. What is the ultimate conclusion that the advertisement wants you to make?
Better than the other.
Better than the others? That's maybe another. I would say most simply, buy the toothpaste. You should buy this toothpaste. Okay. What are the grounds for that argument? What are some of the evidences or data provided to make that claim? 50% wider teeth. Okay, there was a study.
Andrew, can I ask a question about your claim?
Yes.
Wouldn't your claim be better use our toothpaste instead of buy our toothpaste?
Well, if you're the one selling the toothpaste, do you really care if they use it, or do you just want them to buy it?
But they're not claiming buy our toothpaste. I don't think that's a claim that they're making.
I think you could argue, maybe you would say the claim is you should buy our toothpaste, or you should use our toothpaste. I think ultimately it's a statement of, you know, it is best for you to choose our toothpaste.
They don't want you stealing the toothpaste. That's going to cost them.
No, they don't want you to steal it. You could use it without having bought it. So the person
I think the buy our toothpaste is an assumptive step.
is an intermediate step. Okay.
Yeah, it's a, when you come to this conclusion, you should then go buy our toothpaste. I think Chuck hit on the head. Our toothpaste is superior. I think that's their claim in that statement. Because nothing in there says you should use it. They want you to, that statement says, we provide wider teeth, we have a superior product.
Right.
Well, isn't that a warrant?
Well, now we get to the intermediate steps. So we have the grounds of a study that there was 50% wider teeth, and we want to get to the claim that that means you should use our toothpaste. What are some warrants in this argument? And I'll tell you right now, they're not stated. What are the unstated assumptions that go from those grounds to this claim? That you brush daily.
This toothpaste is safe because there's some whitening agents that aren't exactly human, safe for humans.
That it's safe.
That you want whiter teeth.
Okay,
I mean, that's an assumption.
people want wider teeth. I mean, Brace is right. That is not stated.
What if I like them yellow? And I don't care about your toothpaste.
Right? The advertiser's not telling you, you want wider teeth. The advertiser's making the assumption that you want wider teeth. Dan made the point about safety. I don't feel like that's necessarily an unstated step to get us from 50% wider teeth to the claim, but what I would say is that that probably fits into the category of a rebuttal. So if you were to address a potential counter argument, our toothpaste is safe.
Like I say, history is full of people who had bad teeth because of things they were using to make them better. Whiter were not safe.
Right.
They were running their guns.
Good. So we're seeing how, you know, that assumption leads to an inconclusion. Maybe another warrant or another assumption that's not stated is I think Taylor alluded to this with that the product's actually being used. How about, you know, it's being used the same way that it was used in the study? How frequently were they brushing their teeth? Were they barred from drinking coffee while they were also participating in the study? Maybe that would have affected the results. So there's other unstated warrants that can lead to the claim being true or not true. And if we wanted to attack this argument,
Would it be a warrant that they've actually tested it and proven it? Because that's kind of an unwritten claim. To say that makes me think, well, you must have tested it.
I would say, the validity of the evidence typically falls under the category of grounds or backing for the grounds.
Okay.
So, you know, our study was fair and balanced.
I noticed there was no sample size to the study. There was no scope to the study. You're told very little about this, and you're supposed to fill in the blanks that it was, you know, enough of a sample size to draw necessary conclusions and things like that. But none of that is stated evidence that they gave you that their study was valid.
Right. So again, more questioning of the validity of the study, the fairness or the ethical nature of the study, I think is a fair point to attack. I would say, I think the key warrants, if we're just focusing on the grounds that was made and the claims that was made, 50% whiter teeth in the study, you should use our toothpaste. How do we get from A to B? Assuming you will use the toothpaste in the same way, and assuming you actually want whiter teeth, there, you know, if those things are also true, then you would want to buy and use our toothpaste. I wanted to get through more of these because I have a couple more. I think I have one more hypothetical. I've got a couple more hypotheticals, and then I also have the two passages that I put on the question sheet. So we will spend more time on this on Wednesday. I think this is good to get the participation and the filling in the blank kind of exercise going. The next question is this, and I'm putting this out to you guys. I have not yet really done a lot of material on fallacies. I mentioned it in the questions. I kind of asked you to look into it a little bit. Does anybody want to take the time to talk about fallacies in class, or when we're done with Tolman model, do we want to move on to lesson 1, where we're going to talk about the universe and nature?
I think they could be helpful because I think, in my experience, I think sometimes we have been guilty of using logical fallacies as arguments, and it's something we need to be aware of so we can avoid it.
Okay.
I mean, not everybody is going to be a critic of the arguments that you make, but you're going to run into some people who will. And it can be helpful for us to understand at least something about it. Like
Okay.
you said, not necessarily